cold came down hard that morning, and the kind that crept past wool and flesh and settled in the bones like a sickness that would not break. Frost rimed every dead blade of grass in the yard, each stem sheathed in ice that crackled underfoot with the brittle sound of breaking teeth. The sky hung low and colorless, a leaden weight pressing down on the earth, and the air tasted of iron and coming snow that would not fall for hours yet, but promised to bury everything when it did. Evangeline Hartman's fingers had gone past numb around the stems of the roses. She could not tell any more whether she still held them or whether they had slipped from her grasp and fallen into the frozen dirt. The petals were blackening where the frost had kissed them, curling inward like the fingers of a corpse. Her breath came in shallow clouds that hung in the air for a heartbeat before the wind tore them away. She had not slept. Her eyes burned in their sockets, gritty and swollen. The skin around them tight and raw from dried tears, and the wind that had howled through the cabin cracks all night long, bringing with it the smell of wood smoke and despair. She was 19 years old, and her life was ending. Behind her, the horses stamped and blew steam through flared nostrils, their hooves ringing against frozen ground like the tolling of a bell. One of them nickered low and anxious, a sound that cut through the stillness like a knife drawn across bone. Sitan stood beside the hitching rail, motionless as the bare cottonwoods that lined the creek, their branches black and skeletal against the gray sky. He wore buckskin, dark with age, and used patched at the elbows and knees with doeskin that did not quite match the kind of mending a man does himself when there is no woman to do it for him. The rifle slung across his shoulder was oiled black, its stock worn smooth by years of handling, until it gleamed dully in the weak light. 2 feathers hung from his braid, simple eagle primaries tied with sinew and nothing more. No paint, no beadwork, no decoration beyond what function demanded. Just the hard, practical dress of a man who lived by what he could carry and what he could kill. His face gave away nothing. The bones were sharp beneath copper skin, stretched tight his mouth a straight line that did not soften or harden his eyes, dark and watchful in the way of animals that know they are being hunted and have learned to move through the world with the caution of prey that has survived too many seasons. He did not look at her. He looked at the fence line where the townspeople had gathered on horseback and on foot at the cabin door, where the judge's voice droned on in low monotonous tones, at the horizon, where storm clouds were building in sullen towers that promised violence. The crowd leaned against the rails or sat their horses in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the occasional cough muffled behind a gloved hand. A few whispered behind raised palms, but most just stared, their faces blank, with the kind of curiosity reserved for hangings and house fires and other spectacles where death or ruin is the expected outcome. The foreign girl and the savage. They had come to see it done. Inside the cabin, the judge's seal came down on paper with a sound like a hammer striking a coffin lid. Once, twice, 3 times, each blow final and irrevocable. Ava felt each strike in her chest in the hollow space beneath her ribs, where her heart had been before fear had hollowed it out and left only a cold, empty ache in its place. She had signed away her life 3 weeks ago to save her brother's neck from the rope, and now the noose was tightening around her own throat with every passing second. The Hartman family had rolled into Prairie Rose 6 months earlier with a wagon held together by hope and baling wire, the axles groaning under a load that should have broken them 100 miles back. Anna Eva's mother had been widowed 2 winters past in the old country, when the fever had taken her husband in 3 days, flat, leaving her with 2 children and debts that would have swallowed them whole if she had stayed. She had sold everything that could be sold, the furniture that had belonged to her grandmother, the silver that had come from her mother's dowry, even her wedding ring, and bought passage west with the money, and a crumpled land grant deed that promised a homestead on Willow Creek in a place called Dakota Territory. The land was worthless by any reasonable measure. 60 acres of stubble and rock grass, so sparse the chickens went hungry, pecking at its soil, that turned to powder in summer and iron in winter, and refused to grow anything but thistle and disappointment. The cabin was a shell with gaps between the logs wide enough to see daylight through and smell the coming weather. The roof leaked in a dozen places. The chimney smoked so badly that cooking was a choice between suffocation and starvation. But the spring was worth killing for. It bubbled up from a split in the limestone at the northwest corner of the property, cold and clear as glass, feeding a thin ribbon of water that cut southeast across the flats toward the main creek bed. In a wet year, it was a convenience. In a dry year, it was the difference between life and death. For every homesteader, rancher, and cattleman within 10 miles, then men had killed for less. Prairie Rose itself was barely a town, by any generous definition. A double row of false front buildings straddling a rutted road that turned to soup when it rained and dust when it did not. The whole sorry collection huddled together against the vastness of the plains like sheep penned against wolves. The general store smelled of lye soap and salt pork gone rancid in the heat. The saloon stank of stale beer and tobacco spit and the sour sweat of men who worked too hard for too little and drank away what they earned. The church at the East End had a bell that had cracked in a lightning strike 3 years back and now rang with a dull clang that sounded like a man coughing up blood. The school was a log room with oiled paper for windows that turned yellow and brittle in the sun, and a pot-bellied stove that ate firewood faster than the children could haul it from the timber up Copper Canyon. The doctor's office sat above the store, reached by an outside staircase that swayed in the wind and groaned underfoot, like it was deciding whether to give up the fight. Dr. Thomas Pierre was a thin gray man, with hands that shook from too much laudanum and not enough sleep, the kind of tremor that comes from seeing too many men die and not being able to save them. He had come west after the war, though no one knew which side he had fought for, and no one with any sense asked. He kept his own counsel and treated anyone who knocked on his door, white or Indian, and that made him suspect in the eyes of those who believed skin color was a measure of worth and morality both. "A wound don't care who bleeds," he had told Ava once, when she had asked him why he risked his practice and his neck for Lakota patients who slipped in after dark like ghosts. "Neither do I." Miss Adelaide Price ran the school with an iron hand and a soft heart hidden beneath a layer of starch and propriety so thick it could have stood up on its own. She was 34, plain as a fence post, sharp-nosed and sharper-tongued, and had come west because she believed the frontier needed civilizing. And she intended to do the civilizing herself with McGuffey readers and a willow switch for those who could not be persuaded by reason. She taught reading from battered primers, held together with string and hope and arithmetic, on slates she bought with her own money because the town would not spare a dime for education when whiskey and ammunition seemed more pressing. She had a dream she spoke of only to Eva, an irrigation ditch from the Hartman Spring to the schoolyard, so the children could learn to grow things in soil that resisted growth like a miser resists charity. "A garden teaches patience," Adelaide said more than once, her voice firm and clear as a bell. "And blast it all if this territory don't need more of that." The Lakota were ghosts on the horizon, always seen, but never close enough to touch. They moved along the ridge lines at dawn and dusk shadows against the sky, watching the valley the way hawks watch fields for the flicker of movement that means prey. The settlers told stories around their fires, stolen horses, missing cattle arrows in fence posts, left as warnings, but the stories never quite added up when you looked at them straight. The horses usually turned up in some rancher's remuda with fresh brands that had been run over the old ones. The cattle wandered off on their own or got rustled by white men who knew how to make it look like Indian work and profit from the fear. The arrows were sometimes found stuck in trees by men who needed an excuse to call for soldiers and the protection that came with them. Ava had seen them only twice up close before the marriage contract came into her life, like a bullet she never saw coming. Once hauling water from the spring in the early morning, when the mist still lay on the grass like a shroud, she had looked up to see 5 riders on the ridge above the creek. They had sat their horses without moving, watching her the way she watched them. And the silence between them had been so complete she could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. After a long minute that stretched like taffy, they had turned and vanished over the crest like smoke dissolving in wind, leaving her alone with her bucket and her racing heart. The second time she had spotted a lone hunter crouched in the tall grass across the creek, so still she had almost mistaken him for a rock or a stump until he moved. He was tracking something she could not see, his body held in the perfect stillness that comes only from years of practice and patience learned the hard way. When he finally stood, she saw him clearly buckskin and braids a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm and the sharp, clean lines of his face. Their eyes met across the water. He did not smile. Neither did she. The moment stretched tight as a bowstring. And then he turned and melted back into the grass as if he had never been there at all, leaving only the whisper of movement and the faint smell of sage on the wind. She did not know his name then. She would learn it later when there was no walking away and no going back. But the shadow that fell longest across Prairie Rose belonged to Quentin Mallory, and it was a shadow that touched everything and everyone, whether they wanted it or not. He was a big man, broad through the chest and thick through the gut, in the way of men who eat well while others go hungry, with a beard trimmed neat as a banker's and eyes the color of February ice. He owned the largest herd in the valley, a played-out silver mine up Copper Canyon that still yielded enough ore to keep him flush with cash when he needed it, and mortgages on half the homesteads between the creek and the mountains. If you needed credit, you went to Mallory. If you needed a favor, you went to Mallory and paid for it later in ways that were never quite spelled out until the bill came due. And if Mallory wanted something, he got it one way or another, through purchase or pressure or outright theft, dressed up in legal language that made it look respectable. What he wanted now was water. His cattle were multiplying faster than the grass could feed them, and the creek that ran through his land was shrinking year by year as the drought tightened its grip on the territory. The Hartman Spring was small, but reliable, the kind of resource that meant survival when everything else dried up and blew away. Reliable water was worth more than gold when the heat came down, and the grass turned to tinder, and cattle started dying with their tongues swollen black in their mouths. He had come to the cabin in August, with papers in a leather folio, smiling his banker's smile that never reached his eyes. He had laid out the contract on the porch rail and spoken in smooth, measured tones about responsibility and risk and the terrible burden of holding something valuable when you lacked the means to defend it properly. "Mrs. Hartman," he had said, his voice oiled and pleasant, "I'm offering you a fair price. More than fair, if I'm being honest. This spring is a liability for a family in your position. Valuable things attract the wrong sort of attention. Best to let someone with the resources to protect it take it off your hands." Anna Hartman had folded the papers without reading them and handed them back with a hand that did not shake. "No," she said. One word, final as a grave closing. Mallory's smile had tightened at the corners like a rope being drawn taut. He had nodded once, slow and deliberate, tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy, and ridden away without another word, his back straight and his shoulders stiff with the kind of anger that does not shout but waits. 3 days later, Martin was in jail with a noose hanging over his head like a shadow. It had been a setup from the start, clean and simple and brutal in its efficiency. Martin was 16, restless, in the way of young men who have too much energy and not enough sense, too big for the cramped cabin and the endless chores, and too young to know when he was being played. He had been working odd jobs at Mallory's livery in town, mucking stalls and shoeing horses for 50 cents a day, and whatever scraps the cook threw his way at mealtime. Mallory's men, broken nose. Bob, a squat brute with a face like a smashed potato. and rough Rick Donnelly, wiry and mean, with the look of a man who enjoyed hurting things smaller than himself, had taken a shine to Martin the way wolves take a shine to a crippled calf that has wandered away from the herd. They had bought him whiskey at the Red Horse Saloon, clapped him on the back, and called him partner, made him feel like he belonged to something bigger than the struggling homestead and the foreign mother who could barely scrape together a living. When they had invited him into a card game in the back room where the lamp smoke hung thick and the air smelled of sweat and greed, he had thought he was finally being accepted as one of them. The game had turned ugly fast, the way these things always do when the outcome is predetermined. Accusations had flown, marked cards, hidden coins, cheating that no one could quite prove, but everyone believed. Somebody's hand had moved too quick under the table. Fists had followed. A knife had appeared on the sawdust floor near an injured cowhand who was howling and clutching his ribs, blood seeping between his fingers and dripping onto the boards. The knife had Bob's initials carved crude into the handle, but by the time Sheriff Horace Polk arrived with his badge and his belly, and his hand already out for Mallory's money, it was lying next to Martin's boot like evidence that could not be argued with. Sheriff Polk was a fat man who wheezed when he climbed stairs with a badge bought and paid for by Mallory and a mortgage on his conscience that came due every month. He had hauled Martin to the jailhouse, charged him with attempted murder, and set the hanging for the following week as if it were no more remarkable than scheduling a barn raising. Ava had spent 2 days trying to reason with the law, talking until her voice went hoarse, and her throat felt like she had swallowed broken glass, pleading until her knees ached from kneeling on the jailhouse floor, begging men who would not meet her eyes. It had made no difference. The law had decided, and the law in Prairie Rose was whatever Mallory wanted it to be. Martin would hang at dawn on Saturday, unless someone with money or influence intervened, and the Hartmans had neither. On the third day, Mallory had come back to the cabin, and this time he had not been smiling. He had arrived in the afternoon when the sun was slanting low through the dust, dismounted slow and deliberate, and knocked twice on the door with the heavy brass head of his walking stick. When Eva had opened it, he had tipped his hat with mock courtesy and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, filling the small room with his bulk and his presence, and the faint smell of bay rum and tobacco. He had laid new papers on the kitchen table, spreading them out with thick fingers that were surprisingly clean and well kept for a man who owned cattle and mines. Legal papers, marriage contract, debt settlement, terms and conditions printed in dense black type that swam before Eva's eyes like ants crawling across the page. "I can make this all go away, Miss Hartman." Mallory had said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Your brother walks free. Your debts, and you do have debts, considerable ones if my accounting is correct, all forgiven. Clean slate, fresh start. All you have to do is sign on the line." "Sign what?" Anna had demanded, her accent thick with suspicion and barely controlled fury. "What is this you bring into my house?" "A marriage contract, Mrs. Hartman? I represent a gentleman who's in need of a bride. Respectable arrangement, all perfectly legal and proper." The territorial governor himself reviewed the papers. Eva's hands had shaken as she tried to read through the document, but the words kept sliding away from her like fish in a stream. Wife. Transfer of property rights upon marriage. Permanent residency clause. Legal guardianship of abandoned homesteads. Forfeiture of land titles held by women married to non-citizens according to a recent territorial statute drafted by the very council Mallory sat on. "Who is he?" Ava had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This gentleman. Who is he?" Mallory had smiled then, and it was the smile of a man holding 4 aces. "Does it matter, Miss Hartman? Your brother hangs in 4 days. Sign the paper or watch him dance. The choice, as they say, is entirely yours." There had been no choice at all, and they both knew it. She had signed with a hand that shook so badly she could barely hold the pen, her signature a jagged scrawl that looked like it had been written by someone else entirely. 2 weeks later, she had learned the truth at Fort Randall when the Army escort had brought her to the post to meet her husband. He was not a rancher or a merchant or any kind of gentleman. He was Sitan, a Lakota scout who worked for the Army when it suited him and his people when it suited him better. And the marriage was Mallory's trap, sprung shut with her caught squarely in the middle. Once she married a man without citizenship, the law stripped her of property rights as cleanly as a knife taking hide from a carcass. The land would revert to the nearest white male guardian willing to take responsibility for it. Mallory. She was not paying a debt. She was the bait in a snare designed to close on both of them and everyone they cared about. Sitan had taken the news the way a man takes a knife between the ribs, silent and still absorbing the blow without giving ground, but with murder in his eyes that promised vengeance if he lived long enough to deliver it. The Army officer had explained the arrangement in halting Lakota and broken English, stumbling over words and concepts that did not translate cleanly, while Sitan had stood in the middle of the post commander's office with his rifle in his hands and his face carved from stone. When the officer had finally finished his explanation and fallen silent, Sitan had turned to Evie, with eyes so dark they looked black in the lamplight. "You want this?" His English was blunt and guttural, each word a stone dropped into still water. "You choose me." "No." The word had come out flat and honest, and something had flickered in his eyes that might have been respect. "Same," he said. "I do not choose you." But the trap was already sprung, and there was no backing out without consequences that would fall on people who could not afford them. His band was starving on half rations that winter the buffalo hunts had failed 2 years running, and the Army had made it abundantly clear, in the way that armies make things clear, accept the marriage or lose the supplies. His people would die of hunger and cold before spring if he refused. "My word is given to elders," he had told her later outside the fort where the wind cut like a razor and the sky was the color of old iron. "Your paper is signed. We are tied now. Cut one, both bleed." The journey back to Prairie Rose had taken 3 days on roads that were barely more than wagon ruts through grass and rock. Ava had ridden in the wagon with her mother and Martin the marriage trunk, lashed to the back with a rope that creaked and groaned with every jolt. Sitan had ridden ahead on a paint horse with a rough winter coat, keeping distance between himself and the wagon, the way a man keeps his rifle loaded and ready, necessary, watchful apart. The first test had come at Willow Creek on the second day, when the ford should have been easy. A storm had torn through the night before one of those late summer squalls that come out of nowhere and turn everything to mud and chaos. The creek had risen from ankle deep to chest deep in a matter of hours, through the water brown and frothing with debris torn loose from upstream. The wagon driver, a hired man from town, who knew the crossing, had hesitated on the bank, studying the current with narrowed eyes, then made his decision and whipped the horses forward with a shout. The wheels had hit the water, and the current had grabbed them like a hand closing into a fist. Something had cracked deep in the undercarriage axle or kingpin, Eva could not tell. And it did not matter, and the wagon had tilted hard to the left. The trunk had started to slide toward the open tailgate, weighted with iron tools and legal papers, and the family Bible and everything they owned that proved who they were and where they came from. Ava had lunged for it without thinking, her hands closing on wet leather that was slick and cold. The trunk had kept sliding momentum and weight, dragging it toward the water and her with it. Cold water had knifed over the floorboards, soaking her skirts in seconds, the fabric dragging at her legs with terrible strength that pulled her off balance. She had felt herself going over the edge, the water reaching for her with fingers of ice. Then Sitan had been there. He had hit the water at a dead run, no hesitation, no calculation of risk, just action, pure and simple. He had waded chest deep into the current that was trying to sweep him downstream, braced his shoulder against the tilting wagon, and shouted something in Lakota that was lost in the roar. Then his knife had flashed through the air and stuck quivering in the floorboard, inches from her hand. and the blade still vibrating with the force of the throw. "Cut!" he had shouted in English, his voice cutting through the noise like an axe through kindling. "Cut ties or drown with it." Her hands had been numb and clumsy, but she had obeyed, sawing at the leather lashings with desperate strength, cutting free the iron tools and letting them tumble into the creek with dull splashes. The trunk had lightened just enough. The wagon had steadied just enough. The horses had lunged forward with wild eyes, and the whole rig had dragged itself onto the far bank like a wounded animal crawling to safety. Eva had sat in the shallows afterward, gasping and soaked to the bone, her whole body shaking with cold and shock and delayed fear. Satan had stood beside the wagon water, streaming from his buckskin, his hair plastered to his skull, his chest heaving with exertion. He had looked at her for a long moment, his face still carved from stone. "You not panic," he said finally. "Good." It had not been praise, but it had not been nothing either. It had been acknowledgement, hard-won and honest, and in that moment something had shifted between them that neither of them had words for yet. Prairie Rose watched the coming wedding the way crows watch a dying horse, patient and hungry, waiting for the spectacle of suffering that would give them something to talk about through the long winter ahead. Some of the townsfolk laughed about it over drinks at the Red Horse, making jokes about savages and foreign girls and what happened when you let your women get ideas above their station. Others, like Timur Kowalski, a Pole who farmed 40 hardscrabble acres downstream and spoke English like he was chewing rocks, worried aloud about what would happen when Mallory got full control of the spring and started charging for water like it was whiskey. "He will bleed us," Kowalski said one evening, standing in the general store with his hat in his hands and worry carved into every line of his weathered face. "He will charge triple, maybe more, or he will cut off entirely. We lose everything." Everything. Adelaide had refused to let Eva face the wedding alone. She had shown up at the cabin one evening after school with a length of faded ribbon and a bolt of plain cotton cloth that had seen better days, and together they had sewn a dress by candlelight with needles that flashed quick and sure in Adelaide's capable hands. "You scared of him?" Adelaide had asked bluntly, her eyes on her stitching. No. The lie had tasted like ashes on Eva's tongue. Adelaide's eyes had been sharp as broken glass when she looked up. "Then what are you?" Eva had stared at the fabric in her lap for a long moment before answering. "Caught." Thomas had come too ostensibly to check on Anna's persistent cough, but really to deliver a warning that he could not give in town where Mallory's ears were everywhere. "Listen careful now," Thomas had said quietly, glancing at the door as if Mallory himself might walk through it at any moment. "Once you marry him, the law won't see you as white no more. You'll be invisible in the eyes of the court. Mallory will petition to have the homestead declared abandoned on account of you leaving to live with Indians. Then he takes it clean and legal, and there's not a judge in the territory who'll rule against him." "What can I do?" Eva had asked, and had hated how small her voice sounded. "Keep records," Thomas had said. "Everything, every payment, every charge, every signature. If he's cheating you, odds are he's cheating others. Paper can be as deadly as bullets if you know how to aim it right." Satan had visited the homestead several times in the weeks leading up to the wedding, always under army escort, to satisfy the post commander's rules about Indians and settlers mixing. He had dressed plain scout clothes and rifle and knife, nothing more. And his English had been sparse but deliberate, each word chosen with the care of a man who knows that one wrong word can get you killed. "You think I choose this?" Eva had snapped at him once, when he had questioned the contract that had bound them both in chains neither of them wanted. "You think this is what I wanted?" "No. Mallory choose for both." He had paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "I do not like his hand on my life." Another pause. On yours either. Slowly, like ice breaking up in spring, something had begun to shift between them. She had shown him the household ledger one afternoon when he had come to discuss the water arrangement, the neat columns of charges and payments written in her careful hand. He had studied it in silence, his finger tracing the entries with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were scarred from work and weather and violence. This man, he had said, tapping a name with one blunt fingertip. Same month, pay twice, different number. I thought it was an error in their books, Eva had said. No error. He had flipped back several pages, his movements deliberate and controlled. Here, different name, same handwrite signature. See? He had been right. The signatures were forged, the fees duplicated, the charges inflated across multiple accounts. Mallory had been bleeding the homesteaders dry for months, maybe years, one false fee at a time, so slow they barely noticed until it was too late. This book, Satan had said, handing it back with care, is dangerous. To him. To us too, Eva had said. Yes. So be careful. One evening near sunset, he had met her at the creek after scouting upstream to check the water flow that had been dropping steadily all month. The current had thinned to almost nothing, barely enough to wet the stones, and the sight of it had made Eva's stomach clench with fear for what winter would bring. He had watched her struggle with a heavy bucket water sloshing over the rim and soaking her sleeves. Without a word, he had stepped close, but his hand had brushed hers as he took the handle from her grip. They had stood near enough that she could smell sage and wood smoke and horse sweat on his skin. Feel the heat radiating from his body in the cooling air. You stronger than you know, he had said quietly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment before sliding away. Later, as the light bled out of the sky and the first stars began to prick through the gathering dark, he had shown her how to defend herself. He had put his knife in her hand and adjusted her grip with patient firmness, his fingers rough and warm against hers. Man grab you from behind, he had said, stepping close so his chest was nearly touching her back, his breath warm against her ear. You not pull away, you twist here. His hand had guided hers through the motion. Cut low across arm. He let go or he bleed. Simple. His voice had been calm and instructional, but the closeness had made her heart beat faster in her chest. She had repeated the motion until her body remembered it without conscious thought, until the knife felt like an extension of her hand rather than a foreign object. Trust had been built in silence and small gestures in the language of survival rather than poetry. Another afternoon, she had found him in the barn, mending a bridle with careful stitches, his hands moving with the kind of patience that comes from having nothing but time. She had brought him water in a tin cup, and he had accepted it with a slight nod that might have been thanks. Your brother, he had said after a long silence, he fear me. He fears what he doesn't understand. Eva had said, sitting down on a hay bale within conversational distance, but not close enough to crowd. He's heard stories. Most of them lies, I expect, but he's young. Some stories true, Satan had said. Some lies. But fear always real, whether reason good or not. Do you fear us? Eva had asked, surprising herself with the question. He had looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. I fear what your people do with paper and words. I see it take land, take lives, take future. Bullets kill quick. Paper kills slow, but just as dead. It had been the most honest thing he had said to her, and she had felt the weight of truth in it settle between them like a shared burden too heavy for one person to carry alone. Tell me. Eva had said quietly, the words coming out before she could stop them. What was it like before all this? He had hesitated, his fingers stilling on the leather, and for a moment she had thought he would not answer. Then he had spoken, his voice low and measured like he was pulling each word from some deep place inside himself. "We move with seasons," he had said. "Follow buffalo, follow water. Land not something to own, land something to live with, to respect. My father teach me track hunt red sign in grass and sky. My mother teach me stories of our people's songs that keep us remember who we are." He had paused, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped beneath his skin. "Then wagons come, fences, towns, paper that say land belong to men who never walk, it never drink from streams, never give it nothing but iron and fire." Eva had listened with an ache building in her chest, for losses she could barely begin to comprehend. "I'm sorry," she had said, knowing it was inadequate, but not knowing what else to say. "Do not be sorry," he had replied, meeting her eyes directly. "Just remember, when you stand on your land, remember others stood there first. Remember who paid price for your paper." It had been a gift, that story. A piece of himself offered without demand for reciprocity or promises. She had understood that, and she had tucked it away carefully in the hidden places of her heart, where precious things are kept safe. The truth had cracked open like a rotten egg on a cold September night, when the first real bite of autumn had settled into the valley, and the stars overhead looked sharp enough to cut your eyes if you stared at them too long. Eva had gone to Dr. Thomas's clinic above the general store to deliver a bundle of mending her mother had finished climbing the swaying outside stairs, with the wind pulling at her skirts. The doctor had been hunched over his desk with a lamp burning low and greasy beside him, and he had waved her inside with a distracted gesture. "Sit down," he had said without preamble. "There's something you need to see. Been eating at me for days, and I can't keep it to myself no more." He had pulled out the household ledger she had lent him, along with an old law text he had borrowed from the territorial judge's library, spreading them both on the desk under the lamplight. His hands had been shaking worse than usual as he pointed to a clause buried deep in the dense thicket of legal language. "Right here," he had said, his finger trembling on the page. "This is what that snake is counting on. Once a woman marries a man who ain't recognized as a U.S. citizen, the territorial courts can refuse to recognize her property rights. Says she's forfeited her status as a legal landholder. If you leave this homestead to go live in Satan's camp, even for a single night, Mallory can petition the court to declare the property abandoned. Then he steps in as guardian, takes control, and there ain't nothing you can do about it." Eva had stared at the words until they blurred and swam before her eyes, fury and fear warring in her chest. "But I'm not abandoning it. I'd just be—" "Don't matter." Thomas had interrupted, his voice heavy with exhaustion and anger. "Law don't care about intent, only cares about status. You marry him, you become invisible in the eyes of the court. Might as well be a ghost." Miles away across the dark prairie in the Lakota camp, huddled in the lee of the ridge where the wind could not reach so easily, Seton had been sitting in council with his uncle Tokala. The old man's face had been lined and weathered as ancient leather stretched too thin over sharp bones, his voice slow and careful with the weight of wisdom earned through too many winters of loss and survival. "The white man Mallory has made different promises to different people." Tokala had said in their own language the words coming slow and heavy as stones dropped into deep water. "He tells the ranchers one thing, that once the spring is legally his, he will push us north by force. He will blame us for violence near the creek. We will get water for one season, maybe two, then nothing. Our children will starve while he sells the water to others for gold." Setan's hands had curled into fists where they rested on his knees. "He lies to both sides." "Yes," Tokala had said, nodding slowly like his head was too heavy for his neck. "You and the woman are not meant to make peace between two worlds. You are meant to be the spark that lights his fire. He will use your marriage to prove danger, to prove we cannot be trusted. Then he takes everything, and we lose everything, and the army will help him do it, because that is what armies do. The trap had been deeper and more carefully laid than either of them had understood, and they had both been blind to it until too late. 2 nights later, Martin had discovered just how deep the trap went and how much blood Mallory was willing to spill to get what he wanted. He had been working late at the livery stacking hay bales in the loft that overlooked the main barn floor when he had heard voices drifting up through the gaps in the floorboards. Mallory's office was directly below, and sound carried better than it should have through the old wood. Martin had frozen with a bale half lifted every sense suddenly screaming danger. 3 homesteads south of here ought to do it. Mallory had been saying, his voice smooth and cold as river ice. Night raids. Burn them out proper, them out. Make it look like Indian work, buckskin and feathers and war paint the whole performance. Once folks see their neighbors' places burning and bodies in the ashes, the army will have no choice but to clear the Lakota out for good. What about witnesses? The sheriff's voice, nervous and whining. Somebody talks we're all dancing from ropes. There won't be any witnesses, Horace. Mallory's voice had dropped even lower, and the coldness in it had made Martin's blood turn to ice in his veins. Not alive anyway. A few dead settlers is exactly what we need. Martyrs make better arguments than words ever will. Martin's hands had gone numb around the hay bale. This was not fraud or land theft or any of the penny-ante schemes he had imagined. This was murder planned and premeditated with innocent families chosen as kindling for Mallory's ambitions. He had waited in the loft until the voices faded and Boots clomped down the outside stairs, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Then he had crept down the ladder, moving like a mouse in a barn full of cats, and slipped into Mallory's office. The room had been neat, as a pin papers stacked in precise piles on the desk, everything in its place, with the kind of order that spoke of a man who controlled his world down to the smallest detail. Martin had searched with shaking hands, opening drawers as quietly as he could, lifting papers with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. Nothing. Nothing. Then tucked under a stack of invoices in the bottom drawer, as if Mallory had been reviewing it, a folded letter written in Mallory's own careful hand. Martin had unfolded it and read by moonlight, coming through the window, his breath coming fast and shallow. The letter was addressed to someone in the territorial militia, laying out the plan in cold, precise detail. The false flag raids the specific homesteads to target the timing, on the expected response from the army, and the final removal of the Lakota from the valley. Martin had taken the letter, folded it with hands that would not stop shaking, and shoved it inside his shirt against his skin. Then he had heard boots on the stairs outside. Heavy boots. Mallory's boots. His stomach had dropped like a stone down a well. There was no time to replace the letter, no time to cover his tracks. The office had one door and one window, and Mallory was coming up the stairs toward the door right now. Martin had moved on pure instinct. He had gone out the window, hanging by his fingers from the sill for a heartbeat, before dropping into the alley below. He had hit hard his ankle, turning on a rock pane, shooting up his leg like lightning. But he had rolled and come up running, limping down the alley and into the darkness beyond the edge of town, and the letter pressed against his chest like stolen fire. The next evening, in the barn at the homestead, with rain hammering on the roof like bullets and wind howling through the cracks, he had handed the letter to Eva and Seton, with hands that still shook. I should have been braver sooner. Martin had whispered, his voice breaking. Should have seen what he was. But this, he's planning to kill people, women and children, burn them in their beds and blame it on you. Eva had read the letter by lantern light, her hands steady despite the rage building inside her like a fire that had finally found air to feed on. Seton had read over her shoulder, his face carved from stone, but his eyes burning with something dark and terrible. I will not be the rope he uses to hang others. Eva had said, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. Then we cut the rope before he pulls it tight. Sitan had replied, his voice flat and cold. We gather allies. We show this to people who matter. We protect what is ours, and we stop him before he burns the valley. Together, Eva had said, meeting his eyes. Together, he had agreed, and the word had felt like a promise made in blood. Mallory had moved fast after that, like a man who sensed prey was about to bolt and decided to spring the trap before it could. His men had built a crude diversion dam upstream from the Hartman property under cover of darkness, working by moonlight to stack logs and stones across the creek bed and redirect the water toward the mine up Copper Canyon. By morning, Willow Creek had thinned to a sluggish trickle that barely wet the stones, and by afternoon, it was nearly dry. The downstream settlers had started to panic, seeing their water vanish and knowing winter was coming. And without water, the cattle would die, and the people would follow. Ava, Ketten, and Martin had ridden out at first light to investigate, following the creek bed upstream through country that grew rougher and rockier with every mile. They had found the dam in a narrow section, where the canyon walls closed in tight, a rough wall of logs and stones and mud blocking the flow. Broken Nose Bob and Rough Rick Donnelly had been there with a crew of hired hands, working to shore up the structure and make it permanent. Turn back, Bob had called out when he spotted them, his voice flat and hard as a shovel blade. This is Mallory's water now. You got no business here. The hell it is, Eva had said loud enough to carry. This water runs through our land. You've got no right to dam it. We got all the right we need, Rick had said, grinning mean. Now get before somebody gets hurt. The young cowhand had fired without warning, the shot cracking out like a whip. The bullet had torn through Sitan's upper arm, spinning him sideways against the rocks. Blood had bloomed bright red through the buckskin, spreading fast. Eva had dropped behind a boulder, her heart hammering in her chest, so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had seen Sitan go down, seen the blood, and for one terrible moment she had thought he was dead. Then he had moved, rolling behind cover with his rifle coming up, and the fear had transformed into something harder and colder. She had looked around wildly, searching for anything she could use. There, a heavy rope holding a logjam of debris against the upstream side of the dam and the pressure of the water behind it building. If she could cut that rope, the logs would break free, and the surge would undermine the whole structure. She had not thought about it. She had just moved. She had run low in fast bullets, kicking up dirt at her heels and whining past her ears like angry hornets. Her lungs had burned and her legs had felt like water, but she had kept running. She had reached the rope and started sawing at it with Sitan's knife, the blade biting deep into the wet fibers. The rope had been thick as her wrist and tough as iron, and her hands had slipped and cramped, but she had kept cutting. The rope had snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The logjam had broken free in a rush, water surging through with a roar. The pressure had hit the dam like a hammer, undermining the foundation, washing away the mud and loosening the stones. A horse had gone down in the surge, screaming and thrashing. Men had scattered, shouting and cursing. Sitan had fired from cover, his shots precise, despite the blood running down his arm, punching splinters from the logs near men's boots and sending them diving for safety. He had not killed anyone, had not needed to, just made it clear that staying was more dangerous than running. They had retreated together, Martin hauling Sitan up onto his horse, while Eva had covered them with the rifle, her hands shaking. But her aim steady enough to keep Mallory's men from following too close. By the time they had reached the homestead, Sitan's buckskin had been soaked with blood, and his face had been gray beneath the copper of his skin. Dr. Thomas had arrived within the hour, summoned by Adelaide, who had seen them ride in and read the situation at a glance. Thomas had worked by lamplight in the cabin, his hands steady despite the tremor, cleaning the wound and stitching it closed with neat, precise stitches, while Seaton had sat still as stone and made no sound. Lucky, Thomas had said when he was done wiping his hands on a rag that came away dark with blood. Inch to the left, and it would have hit the big artery. You'd have bled out before you made it halfway home. Eva had sat beside Satan while Thomas worked her hands clenched in her lap to keep them from shaking. After the doctor had left to speak with Anna outside, she had dampened a cloth and gently cleaned the blood from Satan's skin, where it had dried in dark streaks down his arm. "Thank you," he had said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. "You did not run. You didn't let the creek take me," she had replied, echoing his own words from weeks ago. "I won't let a bullet take you." She had bandaged the wound with careful hands, wrapping the cloth tight enough to support, but not so tight it would cut off blood. He had watched her work in silence, his eyes dark and unreadable in the lamplight. "I was wrong," he had said after a long moment. "About what?" She had not looked up from her work. "I thought you soft, thought you break when things get hard." He had paused, and when she finally met his eyes, she had seen something in them she had not seen before. "But you like willow. You bend, but you do not break. Strong where it matters." The words had settled warm in her chest, and she had felt something shift between them again, something deeper than gratitude or obligation. "We stand together," she had said quietly. "That's what we agreed. I don't break promises." He had reached out slowly, his uninjured hand finding hers where it rested on the edge of the bed. His grip had been warm and strong, calloused and scarred, and she had held on tight as if letting go would mean drowning in the current that had been trying to sweep them away since the day she had signed Mallory's contract. But their luck was running out faster than water from a cracked barrel. The next morning, Sheriff Polk had arrived at the homestead with a warrant for Seaton's arrest, charging him with destruction of property and assault on honest working men. Mallory had been spreading rumors through town all night, conspiracy violence, savage uprising, foreign girl turned traitor, and the stories had taken root in soil, already prepared by years of fear and prejudice. And then Martin had broken under the weight of it all. He had been sick with guilt for days, the knowledge of what he had done to his family, eating at him like acid, when Broken Nose Bob had found him alone behind the livery one evening and offered him a deal $50 in gold and safe passage out of the territory. If he would just tell them where Eva had hidden the ledger and the letter, Martin had looked at the gold and thought about Eva in danger and his mother growing old before her time and the noose that still haunted his dreams. He had taken the money. The documents had disappeared that same night, stolen from the cabin while the family slept. And when Eva had discovered them missing at dawn, she had known immediately what had happened. She had found Martin in the barn, and the look on his face had told her everything she needed to know before she even asked. "How could you?" The words had come out raw and broken. "After everything, after he nearly got you killed, how could you give him the only weapon we had?" Martin had not been able to meet her eyes. "I was scared," he had whispered. "I thought if I gave him what he wanted, he'd leave us alone. I thought, they're never going to leave us alone." Eva had said, her voice hard as iron. "Don't you understand that yet he wants everything? The land, the water, our lives, all of it. And now we've got nothing left to fight him with." The trust between them had shattered like glass dropped on stone, and there had been no words to put it back together. But Martin, drowning in shame and self-loathing, had made a silent vow that he would fix what he had broken or die trying. He had not told Eva. He had not told anyone. He had just waited for his chance, knowing it would come, because men like Mallory always overreached, and when they did, they left openings. The wedding day had not begun with vows or blessings or any of the trappings of ceremony. It had begun with the thunder of hoofbeats on frozen ground and the creak of wagon wheels and the metallic click of rifles being loaded. Mallory had arrived at the Hartman homestead just after dawn, with Sheriff Polk, 20 armed men, and a leather folio full of legal papers that declared the property forfeited, due to abandonment and consorting with hostiles. His plan had been brutally simple: seize the spring before the wedding could take place. Paint any resistance as savage uprising and take control while the law, his law, looked the other way and nodded approval. Eva, Anna, and Adelaide had barred the cabin door from inside. Anna had held an old double-barreled shotgun, its stock worn smooth by decades of use, and her hands had been steady despite the fear that had tightened the corners of her mouth. Adelaide had stood beside her, pale but resolute, her schoolteacher's spine straight as a plumb line. "You've got no right to this land," Eva had shouted through the window, her voice cracking with fury. "We're not abandoning anything. I have all the right I need, Miss Hartman." Mallory had called back, his voice smooth and cold as a frozen river. "These papers say otherwise. Now open this door peaceable-like, or my men will do it for you, and I can't guarantee your safety once that happens." Then Seton had arrived with 6 warriors, and everything had changed. They had come from the north at a dead run, and their horses' hooves pounding the ground like war drums, and they had swept through the gate with the kind of precision that spoke of men who had fought together and survived together and knew how to move as one. Seton had been at the front, and for the first time since Eva had met him, he had been wearing his full regalia. The war bonnet cascaded down his back in a waterfall of eagle feathers, each one earned through acts of courage that Eva could only imagine. His chest was protected by a breastplate of bone and beadwork that caught the weak morning light and threw it back in defiance. His face was painted with stark lines of black and red, transforming him from the quiet scout she had come to know into something ancient and terrible and beautiful all at once. The sacred regalia was not decoration. It was armor for the soul, worn by men who expected to die, but refused to die quietly. He had dismounted in front of the cabin, and Eva had stepped out onto the porch with the wilted roses still clutched in her fist and tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. The townspeople had gasped at the sight of them together, the foreign girl in her plain calico dress and the warrior in his war bonnet, standing side by side on ground that was soaked with frost and about to be soaked with blood. "No farther, Mallory." Seton had said, his voice carrying across the yard with absolute authority. Mallory had smiled his cold smile. "You're outnumbered, Scout. I count 6 of you. I've got 20 guns. Do the arithmetic and ride away while you still can. Then you lose many men before you win." Seton had replied without a flicker of emotion. "And you die first. I make promise on that." Broken Nose Bob, too stupid or too mean to read the situation, had made the decision for everyone. He had rushed the gate with his pistol drawn and murder in his eyes. The gunfire had started like thunder cracking open the sky. Bullets had slammed into the porch rail, splintering wood and sending shards flying through the air like shrapnel. Children who had come early for the promised wedding celebration, innocent souls who had expected cake and games and stories, had screamed in terror as Adelaide had shoved them bodily toward the root cellar, her own body serving as a shield. Smoke had poured from a haystack that had caught fire from a stray spark, thick and black and acrid, filling the air with the smell of burning. Seton had directed the defense with sharp-barked commands in Lakota and English, both positioning his warriors with the practiced efficiency of a man who had fought more battles than he cared to count. They had taken cover behind logs and fence posts and water troughs, making every shot count because ammunition was precious and could not be wasted. Eva had moved through the chaos without thought, her body acting on pure instinct and survival. She had carried ammunition to the defenders, her skirts hiked up and tied at her waist so she could run. She had dragged a wounded cowhand, a boy barely older than Martin, who had taken a bullet in the leg and was crying for his mother, out of the line of fire, ignoring his weight and the blood that soaked into her dress. She had pushed him toward Dr. Thomas, who had crawled on his belly through the mud to reach the homestead and was now working frantically to save lives on both sides of the battle. Because that was what he did, and who he was. The siege had gone on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, time stretching and compressing in the way it does when death is close and breathing. Then Mallory had played his final card. Frustrated and furious that his easy victory had turned into a costly standoff, he had shouted orders to Rough Rick. Rick had run to the corral and thrown open the gate, then fired his pistol into the air and cracked his whip at the 40 head of longhorn cattle penned inside. The animals had exploded out of the corral in a blind panic, their horns clacking together and their hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. The stampede had come like an avalanche, unstoppable and deadly. The ground had begun to shake. Dust had risen in choking clouds. Men had scattered like leaves before a storm. Eva had felt her heart stop in her chest. The cabin would be crushed. Everyone inside would die. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere to go that would save them. But Seton had already seen the answer. His eyes had swept the yard in one swift, calculating glance, taking in every angle and every possibility. And he had spotted the half-dug irrigation ditch that Adelaide and Eva had started weeks ago, and never finished Adelaide's dream of a garden, abandoned but not forgotten. The ditch ran shallow and slick with morning frost between the corral and the house, barely more than a scratch in the earth, but it was enough. "The planks," he had shouted, grabbing Eva's arm hard enough to bruise. "Pull them up now." She had understood instantly. They had run together to the narrow wooden bridges that crossed the ditch, just planks laid flat to make passage easier. And they had yanked them up with desperate strength, Eva's hands bleeding from splinters and Seton's wounded arm screaming, but neither of them slowing. The ditch had become a trap, invisible under a thin layer of frost, waiting. The herd had hit at full speed, 40 head of maddened cattle with their heads down and their eyes rolling white. The lead animals had hit the ditch and their hooves had slipped on the muddy frost-slick edges. They had gone down hard, their massive bodies crashing to the ground with bone-shaking force. The animals behind them had tried to stop but could not, their momentum carrying them forward into the pileup. The herd had been funneled away from the cabin and straight into Mallory's own men, scattering them like ninepins. Wagons had splintered under the impact. Horses had screamed and fallen. Men had thrown themselves aside, scrambling for safety. In the chaos of dust and panic and confusion, Martin had seen his one chance at redemption. He had been watching from the barn loft, sick with guilt and desperate for a way to undo what he had done. Now he had spotted Broken-Nose Bob near one of the overturned wagons, fumbling with something inside his coat. Martin had recognized the shape, the ledger, and the letter, the evidence he had sold for gold and cowardice. Bob had been trying to throw the documents into the flames that were spreading from the burning wagon. Martin had not thought. He had just moved. He had launched himself from the loft, dropping 15 feet to the ground, and hitting so hard the air had been driven from his lungs in a painful whoosh. But he had rolled with the impact in the way Seton had taught him weeks ago, came up on his feet and then charged at Bob like a man possessed. He had tackled the bigger man from behind, driving him into the dirt with all the strength that desperation and guilt could lend. They had fought with fists and knees and teeth, rolling dangerously close to the stampeding cattle that were still thundering past in waves of muscle and horn and blind panic. A massive longhorn bull, its eyes rolled back and foam flying from its mouth, had charged straight at them with its head lowered and its horns gleaming like swords. Martin had had 1 second to make a choice. He had shoved Bob away from the bull's path with all his strength, sending the man sprawling to safety. Then Martin had thrown himself in the opposite direction, rolling hard, and the bull's hoof had come down so close to his head. He had felt the impact shudder through the ground beneath his cheek. Another hoof had grazed his ribs, and he had felt bones crack like dry branches, pain exploding white-hot through his chest. He had screamed, but held on to the documents he had ripped from Bob's coat, clutching them against his body like they were more precious than his own life. Because they were. The bull had thundered past, and Martin had lain gasping in the dirt, broken and bleeding. But alive, the charred papers pressed against his chest. Sitan's warriors had moved with practiced efficiency through the chaos surrounding Mallory and disarming Sheriff Polk and his remaining men before they could regroup. The battle had been won, but the cost had been high. Then Ava had seen movement from the corner of her eye. Mallory's hand sliding inside his coat, emerging with a small pistol, the barrel swinging toward Sitan's unprotected back. She had not thought. She had just moved. She had thrown herself between them, her body a shield, her hands reaching for the gun. It had fired with a crack that sounded small and insignificant compared to the rifles, but the bullet had torn through the flesh below her ribs like a hot iron spinning her around. Pain had exploded through her body, white-hot and consuming, and she had hit the ground hard enough to drive what little air remained from her lungs. Sitan had seen her fall, and everything else had ceased to exist. He had moved like lightning, dropping to his knees beside her and pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. Blood had been spreading fast across the pale fabric of her dress, soaking through and pooling on the ground beneath her. "Stay," he had said, and his voice had been raw and desperate in a way she had never heard before. "Ava, stay with me. Do not close eyes." She had looked up at him through vision that was starting to swim and darken at the edges, and she had seen fear carved into his face, real honest fear that cut deeper than any wound. "I'm all right," she had whispered, though she had not been sure it was true. "You are not all right," he had said fiercely, pressing his hand hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. "But you will be. I do not let you die. Never. You understand?" Dr. Thomas had appeared like a ghost, out of the smoke, his bag clutched in one hand and his face grim. "Get her inside. Now. I need light, and I need water, and I need her flat on her back." Sitan had lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest and moving toward the cabin with long, swift strides that jarred her wound and made her gasp with pain. Bullets had still been flying, but he had not flinched, had not slowed, his entire world narrowed down to getting her to safety. Inside, Thomas had worked with swift, brutal efficiency, cutting away the blood-soaked dress and probing the wound with fingers that knew what they were looking for. "Bullet went clean through," he had said after a moment that lasted a lifetime. "Missed everything vital. She's lucky. By all the rights, she should be dead." "Not luck," Sitan had said quietly, his hand finding Ava's and holding on like he could keep her anchored to life through sheer force of will. Strength. Outside, the battle had ended as quickly as it had begun. Martin, broken-ribbed and barely conscious, had crawled across the blood-soaked ground and handed the scorched documents to the first person he saw who was not trying to kill him, Timur Kowalski, who had been standing by the fence with his mouth hanging open in shock. "Get these to the army." Martin had gasped through teeth clenched against the pain. "Fort Randall, Captain Thorne, tell him Mallory's planning murder. It's all in there." But fate had other plans. The smoke from the burning buildings had been visible for miles across the flat prairie, a black column rising into the gray sky like a signal fire. Captain Robert Thorne and a full company of cavalry had been on patrol 5 miles south when they had seen it. And Thorne had made the decision to investigate rather than ride on. They had arrived to find the battle already won, Mallory held at gunpoint by Lakota warriors, and his remaining men disarmed and bloodied the yard, littered with wounded and the air thick with smoke and the smell of blood and burned wood. Thorne had been a career soldier, 30 years in the army, with the kind of face that had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. He had dismounted with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on his sidearm, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent his life reading battlefields. Somebody better start talking. He had set his voice flat and carrying the kind of authority that made men straighten their spines and speak truth. And it better be the truth because I've got no patience for lies today. Mallory had tried to twist the story the moment he saw the army arrive, his voice rising in righteous fury as he pointed at the Lakota warriors and the burning wreckage and the blood-soaked ground. "Captain, thank the Almighty you're here. These savages attacked us without provocation. That foreign woman has conspired with them to murder honest settlers and steal land that belongs to—" "Shut your mouth, Mallory." Thorne had interrupted, his voice cold enough to freeze spit. "I'll hear from witnesses first. Unbiased witnesses." Timur Kowalski had stepped forward. First, his hat clutched in his hands, so tight his knuckles had gone white. "Captain, I see everything from fence." He had said his accent thick, but his words clear. Mallory come with guns before sunup. He'd try to take land that is not his. He brings sheriff and 20 men with weapons. Lakota come to defend family. Is truth. Other voices had risen, then emboldened by Kowalski's courage. Adelaide had emerged from the root cellar with 5 terrified children clinging to her skirts, her face pale, but her voice steady as she described how Mallory had tried to evict the Hartmans by force. Dr. Thomas had stepped forward with blood on his hands and fury in his eyes, explaining the fraudulent fees and the forged signatures in the ledger he had examined. Then Martin had crawled forward on hands and knees, his face gray with pain, and handed the scorched documents to Captain Thorne, with hands that shook like leaves in a gale. He was planning false raids. Martin had gasped through gritted teeth. Dress his men as Indians, burn homesteads, kill families, blame it on the Lakota. It's all there in his own hand. Thorne had read the letter by the light of the burning wagon, his face darkening with every line, his jaw working like he was chewing on something that tasted of bile and betrayal. He had read the ledger next, comparing the forged signatures and the inflated charges, his eyes growing harder with each page. Finally, he had looked up at Mallory with an expression that promised no mercy. "Quentin Mallory, you're under arrest for fraud conspiracy to commit murder and planning false flag attacks against American citizens for personal gain. In my book, that's treason." He had turned to his sergeant. "Put him in irons. The sheriff, too. They're both going to Fort Randall to face a military tribunal." Mallory's face had turned purple with rage veins standing out on his forehead like ropes. "You can't do this. I have friends in the territorial government. I own half this county. When they hear about this, your career is—" "My career will be just fine." "Mallory." Thorne had interrupted, his voice flat and final as a coffin lid closing. "But yours is over. Sergeant, if he opens his mouth again, gag him." Sheriff Polk had tried to protest, sputtering about his rights and his authority and due process. But Thorne had simply reached out and ripped the badge from his vest with one sharp motion. "You were Mallory's dog Polk, not a lawman. You accepted bribes, falsified charges, and turned your office into a criminal enterprise. You're done." The soldiers had moved with military efficiency, shackling Mallory and Polk and loading them into a wagon like cargo, while Mallory cursed and threatened and finally fell into sullen silence when a gag was indeed produced. Tokala had stepped forward and then moving with the slow dignity of age and wisdom earned through loss. He had addressed Captain Thorne in careful English, each word chosen with the precision of a man who knew that one wrong word could mean death for his people. "We come in peace, Captain. We come to honor agreement. This man lie to all sides. He tell us one thing, tell you different thing. He want war so he can take what is not his. We ask only fairness. Water we were promised. Safety for our children. Nothing more." Thorne had looked at the old man for a long moment, and something in his expression had softened just a fraction. "You'll have fairness, sir. That I can promise." What's been done here today won't be forgotten or swept under any rug. You have my word on that. It had not been enough to undo generations of injustice. It had not been enough to heal old wounds or guarantee a future free of violence. But it had been something, a small crack in the wall of prejudice and greed that had seemed unbreakable just hours before. The peace wedding that had been meant as a spectacle of submission and cultural erasure had instead become a public unmasking of corruption and murder, narrowly avoided, and the story would spread across the territory like wildfire, changing things in small ways that would take years to fully understand. Weeks passed before the valley could breathe easy again, before the tension that had wound everyone tight as bowstrings finally began to loosen, enough to let life resume something approaching normal. Fences were rebuilt stronger than before, and with help from neighbors who had learned that survival meant cooperation. Wounds healed, though some left scars that would never quite fade. Quentin Mallory and Horace Polk sat in the territorial prison at Fort Laramie, awaiting trial. Their power broken and their influence shattered, like glass under a hammer. Broken Nose Bob and Rough Rick Donnelly had fled west into the mountains, and a few people quietly hoped the winter would be harsh up there, and justice would be served in ways the law could not touch. The homestead remained in Eva's name, recognized by the territorial government, and defended by Captain Thorne's official report. The spring continued to flow cold and clear, feeding the land and the people who depended on it. Eva's wound healed slowly, the stitches pulling tight and then dissolving as Thomas had promised they would, leaving a thin white scar below her ribs that she would carry for the rest of her life. Satan's arm healed as well, though the puckered scar tissue would remain as a permanent reminder of the day they had fought side by side against overwhelming odds. Martin's ribs knitted together with time and rest and careful bandaging, though he still could not take a deep breath without feeling a sharp reminder of what his weakness had cost and what his courage had won back. During the weeks of recovery, something had deepened between Eva and Seton that neither of them spoke of directly, but both understood in the language of small gestures and shared silences. He had sat beside her bed for the first 3 days after she was shot, barely sleeping, bringing her water when she was thirsty and broth when she could eat, and changing her bandages with a gentleness that surprised them both. She had held his hand when the pain grew bad enough to make her gasp, and he had not pulled away or made her feel weak for needing the comfort. "You saved my life," she had said once, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved mine first," he had replied, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it had made her chest ache. "At Dam, at battle. Many times. We even. I don't think it works that way." "No," he had agreed quietly. "I do not think so either." In early October, when the willows along the creek had begun to bud with new green growth and the air had lost some of its bitter edge, the town had gathered at the spring for a second time. There had been no spectacle this time, no hostile audience hungry for suffering. The people who came, farmers and shopkeepers, a few cowhands from neighboring ranches, who bore Mallory no loyalty, and even some of the townspeople who had whispered cruel things before, came because they wanted to witness something rare in that harsh land justice, and the fragile beginning of peace. Eva and Clétance had stood side by side near the water's edge, the spring bubbling steadily behind them, like a promise kept. He had left the war bonnet and the painted shield in his people's camp. Today he wore the simple scout clothes she had first seen him in, with just one eagle feather woven into his braid for honor. She wore a plain calico dress in pale blue that Adelaide had helped her sew, her hair braided with fresh roses that Adelaide had coaxed from her own stubborn garden. The new judge sent by the territorial governor to replace the corrupt official who had rubber-stamped Mallory's schemes read the legal documents with a voice that carried clearly in the still morning air. The Hartman homestead was recognized in Evangeline Hartman's name, free and clear of all encumbrances, Leon's false debts and fraudulent claims. A second document signed by representatives of Seton's band and the army and the territorial government laid out a water-sharing agreement that granted the Lakota guaranteed year-round access to the spring and set fair, equitable shares for all the downstream settlers and for the schoolyard garden that Adelaide had dreamed of for so long. Everyone had expected Seton to claim the deed through marriage rights. The law would have allowed it. Many men would have taken it without hesitation, seeing it as their due and their right. Instead, when the judge had offered him the paper with Ava's name written at the top in careful script, Seton had stepped back with both hands at his sides. "This land has too many names already," he had said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence. "Has been bought, sold, stolen, fought over. Let it keep hers now. Let her name stand." He had turned to the judge and spoken formal words that Tokala had helped him prepare. "I, Seton of the Lakota, give up any claim to this land through marriage or any other law. It stays in the name of Evangeline Hartman. Her land, her choice, her future. This I say before all witnesses here gathered." The crowd had murmured with surprise and confusion, and even those who still harbored fear or prejudice against the Lakota had not been able to deny the power of the gesture or the honor in the sacrifice. Captain Thorne, standing to the side in his dress uniform, had nodded with visible respect. "That's an honorable act, Mr. Seton. It will be recorded in the official documents and cannot be undone without your consent." The marriage ceremony that had followed had been brief and simple, stripped of everything but the essential vows. Dr. Thomas had translated between English and Lakota, stumbling occasionally, but getting the meaning across. "I promise to stand with you." Ava had said, her voice steady and clear. "I promise to protect what we build together." Seton had replied, his eyes holding hers. The judge had pronounced them married under the laws of the territory, and it was done. But the real intimacy had shown itself in what came after small gestures that spoke louder than any vows. When Ava had stumbled slightly on the uneven ground near the creek, Seton's hand had been there instantly at her elbow, steadying her with an instinct that came from months of watching and protecting. When he had picked up a shovel to begin reinforcing the spring's stone lining work that would take days and needed to be done before winter came in earnest, she had picked up the second shovel without being asked, and had fallen into step beside him, and their rhythms matching without conscious effort. Martin had approached as the sun climbed higher, his face a mixture of shame and determination. "I'm sorry," he had said for what felt like the 100th time. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." "You already have," Ava had said, pulling him carefully into an embrace that minded his healing ribs. "You nearly died to save us. That's what I'll remember. Not the mistake. The courage that followed." He had nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. A community gathering had followed the ceremony, unprecedented in the valley's short, violent history. Tables had been set up in the yard on rough planks laid across sawhorses, and both settler families and Lakota had brought what food they could spare. The settlers brought bread and dried apples and preserved vegetables and a haunch of venison that Kowalski had smoked. The Lakota brought dried buffalo meat and berries preserved in fat and herbs that filled the air with scents both strange and pleasant. Children had played together at the creek's edge, their laughter bright and pure and innocent of the prejudices their parents carried. Adults had stood in small mixed groups, conversation awkward and stilted at first, but slowly warming as shared food and shared danger broke down barriers that had seemed permanent just weeks before. Adelaide had stood at the head of the irrigation ditch, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched the first steady flow of water running toward the schoolyard plot she had cleared and prepared with such stubborn hope. "Thank you," she had whispered to Eva, embracing her fiercely. "For fighting, for refusing to give up, for showing all of us what real courage looks like. Thank you for standing beside me. Eva had replied, her own voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have survived this without you. Tokala had approached Eva and Sitan as they stood watching the gathering. His weathered face creased with a smile that made him look younger. You have done well, nephew, he had said in Lakota, which Thomas translated quietly. This woman has warrior spirit. She will be good for our people. And we will be good for her if we honor what has been built here today. Sitan had bowed his head respectfully. She is stronger than I knew, uncle. Stronger than most warriors I have fought beside. Captain Thorne had joined them, his stern face softened slightly by something that might have been approval or hope or both. This is how it should be, Thorne had said, gesturing to the gathering with one scarred hand. Not easy, not perfect, but honest. Built on fairness instead of lies, on cooperation instead of theft. I'll make sure the governor hears about what happened here. What you've built could be a model for other settlements if people have the courage to follow it. It is fragile, Sitan had set his eyes on the mixed gathering. Will break easy if not tended with care. All good things are fragile, Thorne had replied. That's what makes them worth protecting. As the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and deep purple, Eva and Seton had walked together along the creek bank, following the water and checking the flow and discussing plans for spring planting that seemed impossibly far away, but necessary to consider. Your people will need seed, Eva had said, her mind already working through the logistics. And tools for planting. The army rations are never enough to build a real future. No, they are not. But we survive. We always survive. We could share more than water. Eva had said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. Real trade, as equals. Your people know things about this land that mine don't, how to find food when hunting fails, how to preserve meat through long winters, how to read weather signs. We could teach each other. Build something that lasts beyond one season. He had stopped walking and turned to face her, wonder flickering in his eyes. You would do this, bind your future to ours so deep. We're married, she had said simply. That should mean something. Your people are my people now too, if we choose to make it mean that. He had reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and had tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with surprising gentleness. I am glad Mallory's trap brought us together. Not glad for suffering, not glad for blood, but glad for you, for what we made from his greed and hate. Her breath had caught and tears had pricked her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. I'm glad for you too. I was so afraid at first. Afraid of you, of what marrying you would mean, of losing everything I was. But you gave me more than I lost. You gave me choice when the law said I had none. He had smiled, then a real smile that transformed his usually stern face and made him look younger and less burdened by history and loss. We give each other choice. That is what marriage should be. Not chains, not cage. Choice to stand together or stand alone, and we choose together. They had stood in the fading light, with the creek murmuring beside them, and the voices of two peoples tentatively learning to share space and water and future drifting on the wind behind them. The West was still hard, brutal in its demands and unforgiving of mistakes. Winters would still come with killing cold and summers with scorching heat. Prejudice would not vanish because one corrupt man had been arrested and one small alliance had been forged. There would be more battles ahead, legal and social and perhaps physical, because change was always bought with blood and tears and stubborn refusal to surrender to the way things had always been. But for the first time since signing that contract, in a moment of desperate terror, Ava believed she could face what came. Not alone, not trapped, not erased, free-standing on land that bore her name beside a man who had chosen to stand with her rather than over her, surrounded by a fragile community, learning that survival required cooperation more than conquest. The creek whispered its ancient song beside them, carrying water to all who needed it, settler and Lakota crops and cattle schoolyard gardens and winter camps, a liquid promise that life could continue, despite everything that tried to stop it. Eva looked at the homestead standing solid against the darkening sky, smoke rising from its chimney. She looked at the mixed gathering in the yard, voices mingling in a dozen languages and accents. She looked at Setan, his profile strong against the sunset, his hand warm and scarred in hers. This is home, she thought. Not because it is safe or easy or certain, but because it is ours, built with our hands, defended with our blood, shared with those brave enough to do the hard work of peace, worth every scar, every tear, every moment of terror. The future was uncertain, and the peace was fragile, and the haters would not disappear just because justice had been served once. But it was theirs to shape, together, and that was enough.